Nobody teaches you that being too agreeable is a personality disorder. They just keep scheduling meetings during your lunch break. And you show up. Every time. Slightly resentful, completely punctual. Here's what actually happened to you. Somewhere early on, you learned that making people comfortable made you safe. Agreeable children got called good. Quiet children got called mature. Children who pushed back got called difficult. So you filed that information away and made a decision. Not consciously, not dramatically. Just a small, quiet adjustment that compounded over decades. You became easy to be around. And easy to be around, it turns out, is very easy to take for granted. The strange thing about this pattern is how invisible it is while it's happening. You're not suffering dramatically. You're not collapsing. You're functioning perfectly well. You're just slowly, consistently funding everyone else's comfort with your own. Saying yes when you mean no. Absorbing tension that wasn't yours. Volunteering before anyone asks. Explaining yourself to people who never requested an explanation. And calling it kindness. This book is not going to tell you to stop being kind. Kindness is one of the more underrated forms of intelligence. What it's going to tell you is that kindness without structure isn't a virtue. It's a vulnerability. And somewhere along the way, yours got exploited. Not by villains, not by bad people, mostly by ordinary people who simply adapted to what you allowed. That's the uncomfortable part. Nobody had to manipulate you. You were just consistent. The chapters ahead are going to examine this pattern from every angle. The psychology of over-apologizing. The mechanics of why your explanations undermine your own authority. The reason your tone reveals more than your words. The specific moment when reliability stops earning respect and starts earning expectation. None of this requires you to become colder, or harder, or someone you're not. It requires you to become clearer. There's a version of you that's equally warm, equally generous, and significantly harder to walk over. That version doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't issue declarations or start arguments. It just stops moving out of the way automatically. And that small change, that pause before the reflexive yes, turns out to change almost everything. Stay with it. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The Invisible Tax. Most people think the problem with being too nice is that others take advantage of you. That's the surface reading. The deeper problem is what it does to your relationship with yourself. Every yes you didn't mean is a small withdrawal. Not from your bank account, from your self-trust, from the internal sense that your instincts are worth listening to. You feel the hesitation, the tightness, the pause, and you override it. You smile. You agree. You adjust. And you file it under being a good person. Do that enough times, and something quietly breaks. Not loudly. Not in a way that requires a diagnosis. Just a slow disconnection between what you feel and what you do. Between what you think and what you say. You start to become a stranger to your own preferences. Here's what that actually looks like from the outside. A man sits in a meeting. His manager asks if he can take on one more project, framed as a question, structured as an assumption. He feels the familiar weight in his chest. He knows his current workload. He knows the answer his body is giving him. He says yes anyway, and immediately begins calculating how he'll make it work. He's not afraid of the work. He's afraid of the moment right after saying no. that 3-second window of potential discomfort. He pays for 3 months of overextension to avoid 3 seconds of tension. That's not kindness. That's a phobia with good manners. The psychological term for this pattern is self-abandonment, which sounds dramatic until you realize how quietly it operates. It doesn't feel like abandonment. It feels like flexibility. It feels like being low maintenance. It feels like not being the difficult one. Those are the stories. The actual experience underneath is a steady accumulation of ignored signals. Your discomfort signals something. Your hesitation signals something. Your exhaustion signals something. The body is not subtle. It tells you when something costs more than it should. The problem isn't that you can't hear it. The problem is that you've trained yourself to override it in the name of keeping peace. And peace maintained through self-suppression isn't peace. It's a performance with no audience that still somehow leaves you exhausted. I said yes to covering someone's responsibilities for 2 weeks while they sorted out a personal situation. I told myself it was temporary. It lasted 4 months. Nobody asked me to keep going. I just never stopped. At no point did anyone force me. I volunteered myself into resentment, completely unassisted. Here's the part that stings. The tax isn't just paid in time or energy. It's paid in perceived value. When you consistently absorb inconvenience without registering it, people stop factoring your limits into their calculations. Not because they're cruel, because you've trained them not to. You've demonstrated repeatedly that your capacity is flexible, your time is negotiable, your discomfort is manageable. So they manage you accordingly. There's a concept in behavioral psychology called extinction of salience. When something is always available, the brain stops registering it as significant. Your help, offered automatically, becomes ambient, like background noise. Present but not noticed. Not valued, just expected. The fix is not dramatic. It doesn't require confrontation or announcements or a complete personality overhaul. It requires one thing: the pause. The moment before you respond, that half second where your instinct surfaces before your conditioning suppresses it. That moment is where everything begins. Not a dramatic halt, just a breath. Just enough space to hear what you actually think before you perform what you've always done. That pause is the beginning of self-respect. And self-respect, it turns out, is not something others give you. It's something you stop giving away. The hidden cost of being too nice isn't that people take advantage of you. It's that you stop trusting yourself. And a person who doesn't trust their own instincts cannot stand firmly on anything. Every small yes you didn't mean was a vote against your own judgment. You're not here to keep casting those votes. Chapter 2. The reliability trap. Being called dependable sounds like a compliment. It is. Right up until the moment it becomes a job description nobody agreed to pay you for. There is a specific transition that happens to reliable people. And it happens so gradually that most of them miss it entirely. At first, their reliability earns gratitude. People notice. People thank them. There's a warm social reward for being the one who shows up, follows through, handles it. That reward is real, and it's addictive. So they keep going. Then quietly, the gratitude stops. Not because people became ungrateful, because gratitude is a response to surprise. And you stopped being surprising. You became infrastructure. Reliable as electricity. Noticed only when you're gone. Picture this. A woman on a team, sharp, thorough, always delivers. Early on, her manager praises her work publicly. Colleagues seek her input. Her contributions feel visible. 6 months later, her work is still excellent. But now it's just assumed. Projects land on her desk with a casual certainty, not because she volunteered, but because the system reorganized itself around her reliability. Nobody assigned her this role officially. They just stopped questioning whether she'd do it. She didn't get exploited. She got institutionalized. And the cruelest part? When someone less reliable gets promoted, someone who pushed back more, who negotiated more, who occasionally said that wasn't their responsibility. She watches that happen and feels something she can't quite name. It's the feeling of realizing the game had different rules than you thought. Here's the psychology underneath this. Humans calibrate their expectations to observed behavior. This is not a character flaw. It's how the brain conserves energy, by building models of what people will do and then running on autopilot. When your model reads, always delivers, never complains, absorbs extra work without friction, the brain stops asking. It just predicts. You taught it to predict you. And prediction, however accurate, is not respect. Respect requires some uncertainty, some sense that this person's cooperation is not guaranteed, that their yes means something because their no is possible. When the no disappears entirely from someone's behavioral range, their yes loses all weight. I watched a colleague spend 3 years being the most competent person on a team. Genuinely, observably, the best. He was also the one who stayed late, covered gaps, never escalated. The person who got promoted above him had a fraction of his output and twice his willingness to make his own needs audible. I found that deeply unfair for about a week. Then I found it instructive. The reliability trap has a specific mechanism worth understanding. When you're always available, people stop preparing for the possibility that you won't be. They stop building contingencies. They stop respecting the logistical reality of your limits. And when, eventually, inevitably, you reach a point where you genuinely can't deliver, the reaction isn't gratitude for 3 years of consistent service. The reaction is disruption, because they built their system around your unlimited availability. And now the system is stressed. You absorbed so much for so long that your limits, when they finally appear, feel like a betrayal. That is the trap. Your reliability trained people to need you in a way that punishes you for being human. The exit from this trap is not unreliability. It's selective reliability. Showing up fully, but for things you've actually agreed to, on terms that are actually sustainable. This is different from what you've been doing. What you've been doing is blanket availability. What you're moving toward is intentional commitment. Intentional commitment looks different. It has edges, it has conditions. It sometimes says, calmly, without drama, that's not something I can take on. And when you say that, something strange happens. People pause. They recalibrate. They find another solution. The thing you were certain only you could handle gets handled. This is the part that's genuinely funny, in a slightly grim way. Most of the things you've been indispensable for, you were never actually indispensable. You were just the path of least resistance. And paths of least resistance get walked on. Stop being the path. You can still be someone worth knowing, someone people genuinely want in their corner. Just not the corner they use as storage. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Chapter 3. The apology economy. There is a word so overused it has lost its actual meaning. It still costs you every time you spend it. Sorry. Not the sorry that follows a genuine mistake. Not the sorry that carries real accountability and means something. The other sorry. The reflexive one. The one that arrives before you've even assessed whether you've done anything wrong. The one that precedes your questions, cushions your requests, softens your existence so thoroughly that you've essentially been apologizing for taking up oxygen since approximately 2009. Here's what that actually sounds like in practice. Sorry to bother you. Sorry, quick question. Sorry, just following up. Sorry, this might be dumb. Sorry, can I... Sorry, I was just... Sorry. Listen to what those phrases are actually saying. They're saying, my presence is an imposition. My question is a burden. My time is worth less than yours. I am not sure I have the right to speak right now, and I'd like to pre-apologize in case it turns out I didn't. That is not politeness. That is a confession of low status delivered voluntarily before anyone asked for it. A man I know, genuinely intelligent, good at his job, began every single contribution in meetings with some version of, this might be a stupid idea, but... Every time. Without fail. And here's the thing. His ideas were not stupid. Several of them were the best ideas in the room. But he gift-wrapped them in apology before anyone could evaluate them. So people evaluated the packaging. And the packaging said, discountable. He trained his colleagues to treat his contributions as optional, with his own words, repeatedly, for free. The psychology here is specific. Over-apologizing is not humility. Humility is accurate self-assessment. Over-apologizing is chronic self-demotion, a preemptive strike against criticism that ends up doing more damage than the criticism ever would have. You are trying to control the response by lowering expectations so aggressively that nobody can be disappointed. What you're actually doing is confirming that disappointment is your default setting. I still catch myself doing this. Not in big moments, in small ones. The email that starts with, just wanted to check in, when what I mean is I need an answer. The hedge before a direct statement. The qualifier that arrives automatically before the thought is even fully formed. Old conditioning doesn't announce itself. It just shows up and starts typing. The apology habit has a physical component most people don't notice. When you over-apologize consistently, your body learns the posture that goes with it. Shoulders slightly forward, chin slightly down, voice that rises at the end of sentences, as if every statement requires approval before it can land. These are not small signals. Humans are extraordinarily sensitive to them. People read submission in micro-expressions, in vocal pitch, in the angle of a head. You can say the most confident words available in the English language while your body apologizes for saying them. And people will believe your body. This is why the fix isn't just linguistic. Swapping sorry for thank you for your patience is a good start, and it is meaningfully different because it reframes the transaction from apology to acknowledgement. But the deeper work is in the belief underneath the language. The belief that your presence requires justification, that your questions are intrusions, that your needs are inconveniences dressed up in people clothing. That belief is wrong, and it's costing you daily. Here's a concrete experiment. For the next 48 hours, track every apology. Not to judge them, just to see them. Notice how many arrive before anyone has indicated they wanted one. Notice how many are attached to completely reasonable requests. Notice how many are covering for the simple act of existing in shared space. At the end of 2 days, you will have a number. That number will surprise you, and then it will clarify something. You have been running an apology economy with a single participant. You supply the apologies. You absorb the cost. Nobody else in the transaction is actually benefiting. They're just slightly confused by the volume of self-flagellation attached to a simple question about the spreadsheet. The people who command rooms don't apologize for entering them. They arrive, they assess, they speak, not because they're arrogant, because they've accepted that their presence is legitimate. Your presence is legitimate. You don't need permission to speak. You need the quiet, internal certainty that what you have to say is worth the air it travels through. That certainty doesn't come from confidence techniques or power poses or saying sorry less. It comes from the accumulated experience of saying what you think and surviving, of asking what you need and the world not ending, of taking up space and discovering that space was always yours to take. Start small. Replace one reflexive sorry today with nothing. Just the sentence you were going to say. No cushion, no pre-apology. Just the words, standing on their own. They can hold their own weight. So can you. Chapter 4. The explanation addiction. The moment you justify your no, you've already started losing. Not because explaining yourself is wrong, because of what explanation signals in the specific moment after a boundary. It signals that the boundary is provisional, that it exists subject to review, that if the other person can locate a flaw in your reasoning, the boundary dissolves and you go back to being available, which means it was never really a boundary. It was an opening offer. Watch how this plays out in real time. Someone asks you for something you can't or don't want to do. You say no, and then immediately begin constructing a legal defense. I can't because I have this thing, and also there's that situation. And honestly, I've been really overwhelmed lately. And I would if I could, but the timing is just... And now the other person, who perhaps had no intention of pushing back, is sitting across from you holding a full dossier of reasons they didn't request and can now methodically challenge. You handed them the ammunition. You loaded it. You aimed it at yourself. I'm busy. Okay, this will only take 20 minutes. I'm overwhelmed. Everyone is. I'm tired. Just this once. I have other commitments. Can't you move them? Every reason is a door. Every explanation is an invitation to negotiate. And negotiation implies that your no was a starting position, not a final answer. Here's the psychological mechanism underneath this. Explanation after a boundary is an attempt to manage the other person's emotional response. You're not explaining because they need the information. You're explaining because you can't tolerate the possibility that they might be disappointed or annoyed, or think less of you for declining. You're trying to preemptively control their internal experience, which is, if you examine it directly, an enormous amount of emotional labor to perform for someone whose comfort is not your responsibility. A colleague once told me she spent 45 minutes crafting a text message declining a social invitation. 45 minutes. The message itself was 3 paragraphs long and contained 2 apologies, a detailed account of her current stress levels, a promise to reschedule, and a preemptive acknowledgement that the recipient might be disappointed. The recipient responded, "No worries, see you next time." 45 minutes. For 3 words in return. The explanation addiction runs deep because it's connected to something real. the genuine human desire to be understood. You want people to know you're not saying no because you don't care. You want them to understand there's a reason, a legitimate one, that you're not just being difficult. That desire is not pathological. It's human. But here's what's actually happening when you over-explain. You're communicating that your no needs to be earned, that it requires justification to be valid, that without a sufficiently compelling reason, you'd be obligated to say yes. And that framing places you in a position where your default state is availability, and refusal is the exception that must be proven. Flip that entirely. Your time is yours by default. Your energy is yours by default. Your presence, your attention, your labor, all of it yours. When you choose to give any of it, that is the generous act, the exception. The thing that requires no justification is declining. The thing that could reasonably prompt explanation, if you were being philosophical about it, is agreeing. You have it exactly backwards. The practical shift is simple and deeply uncomfortable. When you decline something, use one sentence, not one paragraph. One sentence. That doesn't work for me. I'm not available for that. I'll have to pass. Then stop. Physically stop. Do not add because. Do not add, I'm sorry, but. Do not add maybe another time as a reflexive cushion. Stop after the sentence and let the silence exist. That silence will feel like 15 minutes. It will be 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, your nervous system will generate extraordinary amounts of pressure to fill the gap with explanation, to smooth it over, to make it comfortable, to fix whatever might be wrong. Nothing is wrong. The silence is just adjustment. People adjusting to a response they weren't completely certain they'd get. Let them adjust. That's their work, not yours. If someone directly asks why, you can respond briefly. Other priorities. Prior commitment. It doesn't fit right now. One phrase, then stop again. You are not a defendant. This is not a proceeding. You don't have to prove the legitimacy of your own limits to anyone. Here's what changes when you do this consistently. Your no begins to carry actual weight. Because it's clean. Because it doesn't come with cracks people can push through. Because it sounds like a finished thought rather than a negotiating position. And people, even people who were initially surprised, recalibrate. They start to understand that your yes means something specific because your no means something specific. A yes from someone who never says no is logistically useful. A yes from someone who sometimes says no is genuinely meaningful. That's the difference between being relied upon and being respected. One last thing. Notice how rarely people who command respect over-explain their decisions. They state, they pause, they hold the space after their own words without rushing to fill it. That's not confidence as a personality trait. That's a practiced skill. The practice of finishing a sentence and trusting it to stand on its own. Your sentences can stand on their own. Stop propping them up with explanations they don't need. Chapter 5. The window you left open. Late boundaries don't feel like clarity. They feel like a sudden personality disorder. And people react to them accordingly. Here's the sequence nobody talks about. You enter a new situation, a job, a friendship, a relationship, a collaboration. You want to seem cooperative, flexible, easy to work with, so you say yes to things that cost you slightly more than you let on. You respond to messages at 11 at night. You absorb small inconveniences without mentioning them. You let things slide that quietly bother you. because bringing them up feels disproportionate. And you're new, and you don't want to be that person. Reasonable, right? Except you just wrote the contract, and you wrote it in invisible ink, so only you can't read it. 6 months later, when you finally reach the limit of what you can absorb, you say something. Maybe calmly, maybe not. Because resentment that's been accumulating for 6 months rarely exits calmly. Either way, the reaction you get is not understanding. It's confusion. Genuine confusion. Because from the other person's perspective, nothing changed. You were fine with this last week. You were fine with this last month. You've been fine with this the entire time they've known you. They're not being obtuse. They built their behavior on the foundation you provided. And now you're telling them the foundation was wrong. That is genuinely disorienting. And the fact that it's disorienting is entirely a consequence of the window you left open at the beginning. I watched a friend do this with a business partner over the course of about 18 months. Small things early on, unequal workload, decisions made without consultation, credit distributed unevenly, each one addressable, each one left unaddressed because the timing never felt right. By the time she finally said something, the relationship had calcified around those patterns. What would have been a 10-minute conversation in month 2 became a structural rupture in month 18. Same issue, completely different weight. The weight came from the delay, not from the issue itself. Here's the psychology of why early boundaries feel so hard to set. In new situations, people are running a social risk calculation. The perceived cost of seeming difficult outweighs the perceived cost of absorbing discomfort. So they absorb the discomfort. What they fail to account for is that this calculation compounds. Every absorbed inconvenience makes the next one slightly easier to absorb. Every unaddressed pattern becomes slightly more entrenched. The cost of speaking up increases incrementally while you tell yourself you're just being patient. Patience is a virtue. Silence that you mistake for patience is a liability. Early boundaries don't require speeches. They don't require confrontation. They require one thing: the willingness to name something small while it's still small. If someone interrupts you in the first week, you say, "Let me finish." Not dramatically. Just factually. You finish. They recalibrate. The pattern doesn't form. If you wait 6 months, that same sentence becomes a declaration of war. Same words, completely different stakes. The other thing early boundaries do, and this is underappreciated, is filter. When you define your edges clearly at the beginning of something, you reveal how other people relate to those edges. Some people respect them without question. Those people are worth your time. Some people push gently to understand them. Fine. That's negotiation. That's human. Some people react to a reasonable boundary with disproportionate resistance or manipulation. That information is extraordinarily valuable. And you got it early, before you invested years into a dynamic built on patterns that were never going to work for you. Late-stage boundary setting is expensive. It costs relationship capital, emotional energy, and sometimes the relationship itself. Early boundary setting is cheap. It costs a moment of mild social discomfort. The 4-second pause after you've said something clear and waited to see how it lands. 4 seconds of discomfort early. Or 18 months of slow erosion followed by a rupture. The math is not complicated. What makes this hard isn't the logic. Everyone can follow the logic. What makes it hard is the felt sense in new situations that establishing limits makes you difficult. That expressing preferences makes you demanding. That saying this doesn't work for me calmly in the first week will somehow mark you as a problem. Here's what actually happens. People who set clear expectations early are experienced as easier to work with long-term, not harder, because there's no guessing, no reading between the lines, no wondering what they actually think, no accumulated tension waiting to surface at the worst possible moment. Clarity is not a burden on other people. It's a gift. A slightly uncomfortable gift in the first 5 minutes. An enormous gift over the following years. Stop leaving windows open and then wondering why the temperature dropped. Define the space early. Hold it calmly. And let people show you in the first week who they actually are when they encounter an edge. That's the only information you actually need. Chapter 6. The Approval Market. Here is the market nobody warned you about. Volatile, irrational, completely unregulated. And you've been trading in it your entire adult life. The approval market runs on a simple mechanism. You perform a behavior. Someone responds positively. Your nervous system registers reward. You perform the behavior again, slightly more intensely, to maintain the reward. The price of entry rises incrementally, and you keep paying it because the alternative, disapproval, disconnection, the raised eyebrow across the table, feels genuinely dangerous. Not metaphorically dangerous, neurologically dangerous. Your brain, operating on ancient social software, registers social rejection using the same circuitry it uses for physical pain. This is not a weakness. This is an evolutionary design. Humans who were expelled from the group died, so the brain learned to treat disapproval as a threat signal and approval as a survival signal. The problem is, you are no longer in the situation that software was designed for. You are not going to die because your colleague thinks you were slightly less accommodating than usual. But your nervous system doesn't know that. It's still running the original code, and the original code says, keep them comfortable, keep them close, keep the group intact. So you do. At remarkable personal cost. Watch what this looks like in practice. You have an opinion, a real one. Solid, considered, probably correct. You're in a room with 3 people who hold the opposite opinion. One of them is senior to you. You feel the opinion in your chest, clear, present, waiting. And then you feel the other thing. The quick social calculation. The red of the room. The assessment of risk. And your opinion becomes a question, or a hedge. Or it disappears entirely. You nod along. You find merit in their position. You tell yourself you're being open-minded. You're not being open-minded. You're being approval-dependent. Those are different things. One is intellectual virtue. The other is social fear wearing intellectual virtue's coat. Here's what approval addiction actually costs you. Beyond the obvious. It costs you legibility. When your behavior shifts based on who's in the room, people can't get a stable read on you. They experience you as variable, adaptable in a way that starts to feel unreliable. They like you, but they don't quite know you. And people don't deeply respect what they can't quite locate. The people who command genuine respect are readable. Not simple, readable. You know what they think because they tell you calmly, without excessive hedging. You know what they'll do because their behavior doesn't reorganize itself around whoever holds the most social power in the room. That consistency is magnetic in a way that people-pleasing never is. I spent the better part of my late 20s being extraordinarily well-liked by people who had absolutely no idea what I actually thought about anything. I was charming, agreeable, easy to be around. I was also completely opaque. Nobody knew my actual opinions because I'd developed a sophisticated system for reflecting back whatever the room seemed to want. I thought I was being socially intelligent. I was actually just expensive wallpaper. The exit from approval addiction is not becoming indifferent to others' responses. Indifference is its own kind of performance, and it's lonely. The exit is learning to tolerate disapproval without treating it as emergency information. Someone disagrees with you. That is data. It is not a verdict on your worth as a human being. Someone is visibly annoyed by your boundary. That is their response to information. It is not confirmation that the boundary was wrong. Someone seems uncomfortable after you say something direct. That discomfort belongs to them. It is not yours to absorb and fix. The technical skill here is affect tolerance. The ability to sit in a room where someone is mildly displeased with you and not immediately begin the repair sequence. No extra explanation, no softening, no pivot back toward likability. Just staying steady while they feel what they feel. This sounds simple. It is not simple. It requires practice. Deliberate, uncomfortable, repetitive practice. Start with low stakes. Express a preference that differs from the group's. Something small, something real. State an opinion without cushioning it with, on the other hand, or but I could be wrong. Decline something without offering a replacement. Then observe what actually happens. Not what you feared would happen, what actually happens. Usually, nothing catastrophic. Sometimes, mild friction. Occasionally, genuine respect from someone who'd been waiting to see if you had edges. Almost never. The social annihilation your nervous system was predicting. Here is the paradox that makes approval addiction genuinely funny in a dark way. The more desperately you pursue approval, the less naturally it arrives. Because approval, real approval, the kind that's actually worth having, is a response to authenticity. And you cannot be authentic while simultaneously performing whatever version of yourself you've calculated the room wants to see. The people who seem effortlessly well-liked are not trying to be well-liked. They're trying to be accurate. They say what they think. They do what they said they'd do. They decline what doesn't work for them. And because they're consistent and legible, people trust them. Trust generates respect. Respect generates real connection. Real connection is the thing you've been trying to purchase with compliance. You've been using the wrong currency. Stop checking the market every 5 minutes. The approval market is volatile, and it is never going to give you what you're actually looking for. What you're looking for is internal, and the price of entry isn't other people's comfort. It's your own honesty. Chapter 7. The voice that betrays you. You can say exactly the right thing and still communicate the wrong message entirely. This is the part most people miss. They work on what they're going to say. They rehearse the words. They select the phrasing carefully. They feel ready. And then they open their mouth and their voice does something completely independent of their preparation. It rises at the end of the sentence, or rushes through the hard part, or adds a nervous laugh immediately after the firm statement, and the message that lands is not the one they intended. The words said, "I'm not available for that." The voice said, "Please don't be upset with me." People heard the voice. Tone is not decoration on top of language. Tone is the actual communication. The words carry the content. The tone carries the credibility assessment. And humans process credibility assessment faster than content. before the sentence is even finished, before the meaning has fully registered. The listener has already formed an impression of whether the speaker believes what they're saying. If your tone signals uncertainty, the content becomes uncertain. If your voice signals anxiety, the boundary becomes anxious. If you rush the hard part, people notice you rushing the hard part. They may not consciously think this person is uncomfortable asserting themselves, but they feel it, and they respond to what they feel. Here's what the voice of someone who doesn't fully believe their own boundary actually sounds like. There's a slight upward pitch at the end of declarative sentences, the same pitch pattern as a question, which is the vocal equivalent of, "Are you okay with this?" There's a pace increase through the uncomfortable moment, the verbal equivalent of, "Let's get past this quickly." There's often a smile that arrives too soon after something firm, the social equivalent of, "I said the hard thing, but I'd like you to know I'm still very friendly, and please don't be upset." Each of these is a small signal. Collectively, they form a clear transmission. This person is not comfortable here. This person can be moved. I gave a presentation once. Prepared, structured, genuinely good material. And I knew about 30 seconds in that I was losing the room. Not because the content was weak, because I was speaking too fast. I was rushing through the parts I was least certain about, which happened to be the most important parts. The audience didn't consciously think he's uncertain about this. They just checked out. They felt the instability in the delivery, and their attention drifted accordingly. Same material, delivered by someone with a steadier pace, would have held them. The voice undermined everything the words were trying to build. The mechanics of vocal authority are not complicated. They are just unfamiliar, because most people have never been taught to treat their voice as something they can actually manage. First principle, pace. Slow down. Specifically, slow down at the moments where you feel the most internal pressure to speed up. The uncomfortable statement, the boundary, the disagreement. Those are exactly the moments where rushing signals weakness and slowing signals conviction. Counterintuitive, absolutely reliable. Second principle, pitch. Not artificially, just breathe before you speak. When you breathe from your chest, your voice compresses and rises. When you breathe from your diaphragm, your voice drops and steadies. This is not a performance technique. It is basic physiology. The breath you take before a difficult sentence determines a significant portion of how that sentence lands. Third principle, completion. Finish your sentences all the way to the end, without trailing upward, without adding unnecessary qualifiers after the point has been made. I'm not available for that, period. Not, I'm not available for that, I mean, unless it's really urgent, or finish. Stop. Let the sentence be done. Fourth principle, the pause after. This is the one most people cannot do. After a firm statement, the instinct is to immediately fill the silence, with explanation, with softening, with nervous commentary. Resist that instinct. Hold the silence for 2 seconds after you finish. 2 seconds of eye contact and nothing else. This will feel like an eternity. It communicates that you stand behind what you just said, that you're not waiting to see if it's okay, that the statement is complete because you decided it was complete. Those 2 seconds of silence do more work than 3 sentences of explanation ever could. Here's the deeper truth about tone and why it matters beyond individual interactions. Your vocal patterns are habitual. They've been forming for decades. They reflect your actual internal relationship with authority, with conflict, with the legitimacy of your own needs. You cannot consistently speak with steadiness while internally believing your limits are inconveniences. The voice will leak the belief every time, which means the voice is actually a diagnostic tool. When you notice yourself rushing or rising in pitch or laughing nervously after a firm statement, that's information. Not about your technique, about your actual level of comfort with what you just said. The voice is honest in ways the mind isn't. The long-term fix is not vocal training. It's the accumulated experience of saying firm things and having the world not end. Every time you state a boundary and hold the silence after and the other person adjusts, your nervous system updates its prediction. The threat assessment recalibrates. The next time, the voice is slightly steadier. Not because you practiced a technique, because you have evidence. Evidence that your limits are survivable to express. That disagreement doesn't destroy relationships. That the silence after a firm sentence is just silence, not the beginning of catastrophe. Build that evidence deliberately. One conversation at a time. Slow the pace slightly. Breathe before the hard part. Finish the sentence. Hold the 2 seconds. And notice gradually that the voice stops betraying you, because it finally has something true to carry. Chapter 8. The Standard Operating Procedure. Kindness is not a strategy, it is a disposition. And a disposition without a strategy gets eaten alive by the first person who has one. This is the distinction most genuinely kind people never make. They believe that if they are good enough, consistent enough, generous enough, the quality of their character will function as a system. That being a good person is itself an organizing principle for how they'll be treated. That virtue, expressed continuously, will generate fair outcomes. It won't. Not because the world is cruel, because the world is indifferent. And indifference fills the vacuum left by undefined expectations with whatever is most convenient. Here's what actually happens when you operate from kindness alone, without standards underneath it. You become a resource. Not a person, a resource. Resources get allocated. Resources get optimized. Resources get used until they're depleted, and then people look around, slightly confused, wondering what happened to the thing that was always there. You were always there. That was the problem. Picture an office. There's a person in it who is genuinely, authentically warm, good at their job, willing to help, always has time for a question, always picks up the slack, never makes arriving late to meetings or missing deadlines feel like a big deal, because they absorb the consequences without complaint. Everybody likes this person. Nobody protects this person. When budgets get cut, this person's likability does not function as armor. When credit gets distributed, this person's generosity does not generate reciprocal generosity. When the hard conversations happen about who is essential and who is expandable, being well-liked turns out to have a completely different value than being clearly, visibly, non-negotiably necessary. Warmth is not a standard. It's a climate. And climates are nice, but they don't set terms. Standards set terms. A standard is not a rule you announce. It is a pattern you enforce, quietly, consistently, without emotional escalation. It exists not in what you say once, but in what you do every time. The difference between a standard and a stated preference is follow-through. Stated preferences without follow-through are noise. Standards with consistent follow-through become identity. And identity generates respect in a way that niceness never can. Here's the specific psychology of why this works. When someone encounters a consistent pattern in another person's behavior, they stop testing it. Not consciously. The brain just updates its model. This person does not absorb disrespect. This person follows through on what they said. This person's yes means something because their no is real. The model updates. The behavior around you adjusts. Not because you demanded it, because you demonstrated it. I know someone who has never once raised her voice in a professional setting. Never delivered a speech about respect or boundaries or what she will and won't tolerate. She simply, consistently, without drama, disengages when conversations become disrespectful and re-engages when they return to productive ground. No announcement, no explanation, just a reliable pattern. People who have worked with her for more than a month know this about her, and they adjust accordingly. Before they would have pushed, before they arrived, that is a standard operating in the world without making a sound. The practical work here is definition. You cannot enforce what you haven't defined, even internally. So define it. Not a manifesto, not a list of demands, just clarity inside your own understanding about what you participate in and what you don't. What you absorb and what you name. What you let slide and what you address. Once, calmly. 5 things. That's enough to start. 5 non-negotiables that are genuinely non-negotiable, not aspirational, not performative, actually enforced. They don't need to be dramatic. The most effective standards are mundane. I don't respond to disrespect. I don't commit to things I can't deliver. I don't absorb other people's planning failures as my emergencies. I don't engage in conversations that consistently go nowhere useful. I don't extend access to people who consistently misuse it. Quiet, unglamorous, completely transformative in practice. Here's what happens when you begin enforcing standards consistently. Some people pull back. This is the part that frightens most people into abandoning the experiment. The withdrawal of warmth from people who were accustomed to unlimited access. It feels like punishment. It feels like evidence that standards damage relationships. What it's actually evidence of is who valued you and who valued your utility. Those are not the same group. And finding out which group someone belongs to is genuinely useful information, slightly uncomfortable to receive, extremely valuable to have. The people who valued you adjust and stay. The people who valued your utility drift toward easier targets. Both outcomes are correct. There's one more element to standards that almost nobody discusses: self-application. Standards only generate respect when they're symmetrical. If you expect punctuality, you must be punctual. If you expect honesty, you must be honest. If you expect people to follow through, you must follow through. Standards that only apply outward are not standards. They're grievances with pretensions. The internal version of this is the most important. When you set a standard with yourself, I will finish this sentence. I will hold this boundary. I will not apologize for this decision. And then you keep it. Your own self-trust increases. That increase is not subtle. You feel it physically. A slight steadiness that wasn't there before. A reduction in the background noise of second-guessing. Self-trust is the foundation that everything else is built on. Tone, boundaries, standards, all of it wobbles without it. And self-trust is built the same way external trust is built. Through consistent follow-through. Through doing what you said you would do, especially in the moments when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. Kindness is worth keeping. It is genuinely worth keeping. The warmth, the generosity, the care, Those are not the problem, and they are not what needs to change. What needs to change is the infrastructure underneath. Replace unlimited access with conditional access. Replace absorbed inconvenience with named inconvenience. Replace stated preferences with enforced patterns. Replace kindness as a strategy with kindness as a byproduct of a person who has their standards intact. That person is still warm, still generous, still worth knowing, just no longer available for everything. And that distinction, that small, structural, quietly enforced distinction, is what respect actually responds to. Chapter 9. The Shrinking Act. There is a specific kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. You know the one. It arrives after social interactions that should have been fine, after conversations where nothing went wrong, technically. After days where you were pleasant and accommodating and helpful and completely, quietly exhausted by the effort of being all three simultaneously. You get home, you sit down, and you feel like you've been running a performance that nobody bought tickets to. That tiredness is the cost of the shrinking act. The shrinking act is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's a collection of micro-adjustments made continuously in almost every social situation, each one small enough to dismiss individually, collectively forming a pattern that quietly hollows you out. You make yourself slightly quieter in rooms where someone louder is present. You soften your opinion when you sense it might create friction. You take up slightly less physical space than you're entitled to. Pull your elbows in, cross your ankles. Make yourself compact and unthreatening and easy to overlook. You've been doing this so long, you experience it as your personality. It isn't your personality, it's your adaptation. Here's what the shrinking act actually costs, beyond the tiredness. It costs you presence. Not in the abstract, motivational poster sense, in the literal, observable sense. People who consistently minimize themselves become genuinely difficult to notice. Not because they're invisible, because they've trained the people around them to look past them. When you never claim space, people stop allocating it to you. When you never interrupt, people stop leaving gaps for you. When you never push back, people stop expecting resistance and stop factoring your perspective into their calculations. You become the person in the room whose absence would take a while to register. There's a particular version of this that happens to people who are genuinely capable. They sit in meetings with real expertise, real insight, real solutions to the problem being discussed, and they wait. They wait for a gap that never quite appears. They wait until the moment feels right, which it never quite does. They wait until someone else says a version of what they were going to say, and they feel the familiar mixture of relief and erasure. They didn't have to speak, and they didn't get to speak. Both things happened simultaneously. The shrinking act is efficient that way. I know this one personally. There was a period where I became extraordinarily good at being in rooms without being in rooms. Present, attentive, processing everything, and contributing approximately nothing. I told myself I was listening. I was hiding. The difference is that listening serves the conversation. Hiding serves the anxiety. I was very productive at anxiety. The mechanics of the shrinking act are worth understanding because they operate below conscious awareness. The body leads. Before you've made any decision about whether to speak, your body has already communicated your intention. Shoulders that curve inward signal closure. A chin that drops slightly signals submission. Eyes that break contact a half-second too early signal uncertainty. These are not choices you make consciously. They're habitual postures your nervous system learned in situations where smallness felt safer than visibility. They made sense then. They're expensive now. Physical expansion is not arrogance. This is worth saying directly because many people conflate taking up space with imposing on others. They're not the same thing. Taking up your actual, appropriate amount of physical and social space is neutral. It's the baseline. Arrogance is taking space that belongs to someone else. What most over-apologizers are doing is taking less than what belongs to them and then feeling vaguely resentful that nobody's noticed the sacrifice. Nobody notices the sacrifice. They just experience the absence. Here's a concrete experiment. In your next meeting or social situation, track how many times you start to speak and don't. Not can't, don't. The thought forms, the impulse arrives, and then something intervenes. Too late, too obvious. Someone else will say it. Not worth the friction. Track those moments for a week. The number will be larger than you expect, and each one represents a small decision to make yourself less than present in a situation that had already given you a seat at the table. You were invited, you showed up, and then you made yourself a background element. The shrinking act has a particular relationship with kindness that's worth naming. Many people who consistently minimize themselves frame it as consideration. I don't want to dominate. I don't want to make it about me. I want to leave room for others. Those instincts are not wrong. They're just being applied without any corresponding instinct to also show up. Consideration that only ever moves in one direction, toward your own erasure, is not consideration. It's a habit wearing consideration's clothing. Real consideration is dynamic. It makes room for others and claims room for itself. It listens and it speaks. It defers when deferral is genuinely appropriate, and it holds ground when holding ground is genuinely necessary. It doesn't just shrink reflexively as a default setting. The expansion process is uncomfortable, and it's cumulative. You don't fix the shrinking act in one conversation. You fix it across dozens of small moments, each one slightly larger than what felt comfortable before. You speak when you feel the impulse, before the internal editor intervenes. You hold your posture instead of collapsing it. You stay in the room fully instead of performing presence while actually hiding. And gradually, something shifts. The rooms start to feel different. Not because they changed, because you stopped disappearing in them. You were always large enough to be here. You just kept folding yourself up out of an old habit that never actually served you as well as you thought it did. Stop the act. The audience never needed the performance. They needed you. Chapter 10. The overgiverness loop. At some point, giving more stopped being generosity and became a negotiating strategy. You just never admitted that to yourself. Here's the loop, described precisely. You give generously. The response is less than you hoped for. Less gratitude, less reciprocation, less visible appreciation than the giving seemed to warrant. So you give more. The logic, unexamined, is that you haven't given enough yet. That if you reach the right threshold of generosity, the response will finally match the investment. That somewhere just ahead of your current level of giving is the amount that will produce the recognition you're actually looking for. It won't. Because the recognition you're looking for is not a response to volume. It's a response to value, and value is generated by scarcity, not abundance. The more you give automatically, the less each individual act of giving registers. You are inflating the currency. And inflated currency buys less, not more, of the thing you're trying to purchase. This is the overgiverness loop. You give more to compensate for feeling undervalued. Giving more makes you more taken for granted. Being more taken for granted makes you feel more undervalued, which makes you give more. It is a perfect, self-sustaining system for producing resentment. Watch what it looks like from the outside. There's a person in a friendship who consistently does more, plans the gatherings, remembers the details, follows up after hard conversations, shows up early and stays late. The other person receives all of this, accepts it, enjoys it, and reciprocates at roughly half the intensity. Not out of malice, just out of calibration. They've calibrated their effort to the level the dynamic requires, which is not very much, because the other person is covering the gap automatically. Now the person doing more starts to feel something, a quiet resentment, a sense of imbalance that they can't quite name because naming it would require admitting they've been keeping score, which feels uncomfortably transactional for someone who thinks of themselves as genuinely generous. But they have been keeping score. Everyone does. The difference is whether you acknowledge the scorecard or pretend it doesn't exist while letting it determine your emotional state. The pretending is exhausting, and it produces a specific kind of bitterness. Not loud, not dramatic, just a slow withdrawal of warmth from the relationship while the behavior stays exactly the same. You keep showing up. You keep giving. But something behind it has gone flat. The giving has become mechanical, performed. A habit you can't break because stopping would require a conversation you don't know how to have. I did this for the better part of a friendship that lasted 4 years. Gave generously, expected nothing explicitly, felt quietly wronged by the predictable outcome of that arrangement. The other person was not a bad friend. They were a person who responded to the dynamic I had established. I had established a dynamic in which my giving required nothing in return, so they required nothing of themselves. And I spent 4 years slightly resentful of a situation I had designed. The exit from the overgiverness loop is not giving less dramatically. It's giving differently, intentionally, from a place of genuine choice rather than compensatory anxiety. The question to ask before any act of generosity is not how much, but why. If the answer is because I want to, clean, simple, no strings, give freely. If the answer involves because otherwise, or because they might, or because I've been feeling like, stop. That's not generosity. That's a transaction disguised as generosity. And transactions require explicit terms. Implicit transactions are where resentment lives. Here's what changes when you contract your giving to its intentional core. The giving that remains becomes visible in a way it wasn't before. When you do something generous and it's clearly a choice, clearly not automatic, clearly not reflexive, clearly coming from actual willingness, people feel the difference. They can't always articulate it, but they feel that this particular act of generosity meant something, that it was selected, not defaulted to. Selected generosity lands differently than automatic generosity. It registers. It generates genuine gratitude rather than comfortable expectation. It shifts the dynamic from resource extraction to actual exchange. There's another element to the loop that's rarely discussed: the identity investment. Many overgivers have, over time, built their sense of self around their generosity. Being the generous one, the caring one, the one who shows up. This is not just behavior, it's identity. Which means reducing the giving doesn't just feel like changing a habit. It feels like losing a self. That feeling is real. It's also worth examining. Because an identity built entirely on what you do for others is extraordinarily vulnerable. It requires constant performance to maintain. It collapses the moment you have nothing left to give, which overgivenness eventually guarantees. And it makes your self-worth contingent on other people's gratitude, which, as previously established, is not a stable market. The more durable identity is not the generous one. It's the intentional one. The person who gives when giving is right and doesn't when it isn't. The person whose yes is an actual yes and whose no is an actual no. The person who shows up fully when they show up, because they're not depleted from showing up when they shouldn't have. That person has something left, and what they have left is real. Here's the shift in plain language. Stop giving to be valued. Start giving because you value it. Those sound similar. They produce completely different internal experiences and completely different external outcomes. One is a loop, the other is a choice. Loops are exhausting, choices are sustaining. Get out of the loop, not by becoming less generous, by becoming more honest about why you're generous, and letting that honesty be the thing that determines how much. Chapter 11. The friction phobia. Somewhere along the way, you confused discomfort with danger. That single confusion has been running your decisions ever since. Here's what friction phobia actually looks like in practice. Not the dramatic avoidance of obvious conflict. Most people manage that eventually. The subtler version. The version where you preemptively adjust your behavior to prevent even the possibility of mild tension. Where you soften a true statement before it leaves your mouth because you've already predicted the other person's discomfort and begun managing it. Before they've had any reaction at all. Where you volunteer to absorb an inconvenience nobody asked you to absorb. Because the alternative, the moment of slight awkwardness where someone else might have to deal with it, feels genuinely intolerable. You are not avoiding conflict. You are avoiding the 3-second pause before the conflict that never actually materializes. The anticipation is the phobia. The conflict itself, when it occasionally arrives, is usually survivable. But the anticipation, the prediction of social pain, the preemptive management of imagined discomfort that runs constantly, exhaustingly, in the background of almost every interaction. And it costs you daily whether or not the conflict ever shows up. Here's what friction actually is, stripped of the threat response it triggers. Friction is information. When you say something firm and the other person pushes back, that's data. When you decline something and there's a moment of awkward silence, that's adjustment. When you hold a position under mild social pressure and the room gets briefly uncomfortable, that's the system recalibrating to a new input. None of that is damage. All of it is useful. The absence of friction, on the other hand, is not harmony. It is a vacuum, and vacuums in human dynamics don't stay empty. They fill with assumptions, with expanding expectations, with the quiet, incremental testing of limits that happens when limits have never visibly existed. The person who never creates friction doesn't have a friction-free life. They have a life in which other people's friction expands to fill the available space. Your discomfort tolerance is the actual variable, not the friction itself. There's a specific physiological sequence worth understanding. You anticipate potential conflict. Your nervous system registers threat. Cortisol rises, heart rate increases. The body prepares for danger, and then you avoid the conflict. The physiological response subsides. Your nervous system registers relief, and that relief is reinforcing. The avoidance worked. The danger passed. Except no danger was ever actually there. What you reinforced was not safety. You reinforced the prediction that discomfort equals danger. Next time, the threshold is slightly lower. The anticipatory response arrives earlier. The avoidance happens faster. The phobia deepens. This is how friction phobia becomes structural, not through one dramatic experience, through 10,000 small reinforcements of the idea that mild social tension is something to be escaped rather than tolerated. I sat in a conversation once where I needed to say something that would have created about 40 seconds of awkwardness. I didn't say it. I navigated around it, above it, extensively beside it, for the better part of an hour. The conversation ended pleasantly. The issue remained completely unaddressed and resurfaced 3 months later in a form that required a genuinely difficult conversation lasting 2 hours. I had traded 40 seconds of friction for 2 hours of damage control. The math was not in my favor. It never is. The rehabilitation of your relationship with friction is not about becoming confrontational. Confrontation for its own sake is just friction phobia's aggressive cousin, a different way of mishandling the same discomfort. The goal is neutrality, the ability to be in a moment of mild social tension without treating it as an emergency that requires immediate resolution. Practically, this looks like pausing when you feel the urge to preemptively smooth something over. Asking yourself whether the discomfort you're anticipating is yours or theirs. Noticing whether the adjustment you're about to make is genuinely considerate or whether it's friction avoidance dressed as consideration. Then, sometimes, not always, not dramatically, letting the friction exist, saying the true thing instead of the smooth thing, holding the position instead of finding sudden merit in the opposing view, leaving the silence after the firm statement instead of filling it with softening commentary, and observing what actually happens. What actually happens is almost never what the threat response predicted. The other person thinks for a moment. The dynamic adjusts. The conversation continues. Sometimes it continues better than it would have if you'd smoothed everything over, because now there's actual information in the room rather than a performance of harmony over unaddressed reality. Friction, handled calmly, is not the opposite of good relationships. It is a component of honest ones. The relationships in your life with the least friction are probably not your best ones. They're your most managed ones. The ones where you've worked hardest to prevent any discomfort from surfacing. Those relationships feel smooth. They also feel slightly hollow, slightly performed, slightly like two people being very careful around each other, rather than two people who actually know each other. Real familiarity includes friction. It includes the experience of disagreeing and continuing, of saying something hard and the relationship surviving it, of finding out that the other person can handle your actual edges and you can handle theirs. That discovery is only available through friction. Stop treating it like structural damage. It's the sound of something real being built. Chapter 12. The calm that commands. Aggression tries to overpower. Calm simply refuses to move. One of those requires constant energy. The other requires almost none. And yet most people, when they finally decide to stop being walked over, reach for aggression first. Because aggression feels like strength. It's loud. It's visible. It produces an immediate reaction. It feels like doing something. What it actually does is hand control of the interaction to whoever remains calmer, which, if you've just raised your voice, is not you. Here's the architecture of calm authority, described precisely. It is not the absence of feeling. It is not performed serenity or meditative detachment or the 1,000-yard stare of someone who has simply stopped caring. It is the capacity to have a clear, strong internal response to something, and to choose deliberately how much of that response becomes the output. The feeling arrives. You acknowledge it. You select your expression of it. That gap between feeling and expression is where authority lives. Most people have no gap. The feeling arrives and immediately becomes the output. Someone challenges them and they react. Someone pushes and they either push back or collapse. The stimulus produces the response with no deliberate space in between. And whoever can maintain the gap in that moment has a structural advantage over whoever can't. Calm is not passive. This is the misconception that keeps people reaching for aggression instead. Calm under pressure is one of the more demanding things a nervous system can do. It requires active regulation, breathing deliberately, slowing speech intentionally, holding eye contact when the instinct is to look away, finishing sentences when the instinct is to trail off. None of that is passive. It is precise, continuous, effortful control expressed in a way that looks effortless. That apparent effortlessness is what makes it commanding. Picture two people in a disagreement. One is visibly agitated, voice raised, pace quickened, energy scattered across the room. The other is still, not cold, not robotic, just still. Same temperature at the beginning of the conversation as at the end. When the agitated person finishes a heated point, the still person pauses, breathes, responds at the same measured pace they started with. Who do you believe? Not the louder one, the steadier one. Because steadiness communicates that the person has already processed the pressure and found it manageable. And if they find it manageable, it probably is. The nervous system of the person watching takes its cue from the nervous system of the person who appears least threatened. Calm is contagious in a way aggression never is. Aggression escalates. Calm de-escalates, not by avoiding the substance of the conflict, but by refusing to let the emotional temperature of the room determine the quality of the response. There was a manager I observed once who was remarkable at this, in a way that was almost unsettling. When someone came to her with a problem, urgent, emotional, poorly organized, she would let them finish. Completely finish. Then she would pause for what felt like slightly too long, and then she would ask one question, one precise question that reframed the entire situation. She never matched the urgency, she never escalated, and somehow, in every instance, the person who'd arrived frantic left grounded. She wasn't performing calm, she was actually calm. And her actual calm reorganized the emotional field of every room she sat in. That is authority. Not rank, not volume, not the ability to dominate, the ability to remain the most regulated person in the room, regardless of what the room is doing. The physiological mechanics of this are learnable. They're not personality traits locked at birth. They're skills, specific, trainable, improvable with deliberate practice. Start with breath. Before any difficult conversation, 3 slow breaths. Not conspicuously, just enough to shift from chest breathing to diaphragmatic breathing. This single adjustment lowers your heart rate, drops your vocal pitch slightly, and gives your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for deliberate choice, a marginal advantage over your amygdala, the part responsible for react first, assess later. The advantage is small. In high-stakes moments, small advantages are the only ones available. Then pace. Deliberately slow your speech by about 10% in moments of pressure. Not enough to seem strange, enough to break the automatic connection between external pressure and internal rush. When you slow down under pressure, you're communicating to everyone present that the pressure is not governing you. Then the pause after. The 2 seconds of silence following a firm statement, the held eye contact, the absence of immediate softening. These are not dramatic gestures. They are the behavioral equivalent of planting your feet. They communicate without words that what was just said is complete and will not be revised under social pressure. Here's what most people don't realize about developing calm authority. The people around you will test it, not maliciously, just as a natural response to encountering a new pattern. They've learned to expect a certain version of you. When that version changes, they probe to see if the change is real or temporary. They push slightly. They escalate slightly. They deploy whatever has historically produced compliance from you. If you hold, calmly, without counter-escalating, without collapsing, they update their model. The testing stops. Not because you won a confrontation, because you demonstrated a consistent pattern and the brain stops testing patterns it has infirmed. This takes repetition. 3 times minimum before most people update their model. 10 times before it becomes their new baseline expectation of you. Patience is required. Not the patience of endless accommodation. The patience of someone who knows the process takes as long as it takes and is not going to abandon it because it didn't work immediately. The deepest truth about calm is this: it is not a technique you deploy. It is a relationship you develop with your own nervous system, with your own emotional responses, with the gap between stimulus and output. The technique gets you started. The relationship is what sustains it, and the relationship develops the same way every other meaningful relationship does. Through showing up, consistently, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Because the moment when you most want to raise your voice is the exact moment when staying level produces the most impact. Aggression announces itself and asks for a response. Calm arrives quietly and changes everything. Chapter 13: The Slowest Revolution. Respect doesn't arrive like a verdict. It accumulates like evidence, and so does the loss of it. This is the thing about the transformation described across these chapters. It doesn't happen in a single conversation, a single boundary held, a single moment where you finally said what you meant and felt the room shift. It happens across hundreds of those moments, most of them small, most of them unwitnessed by anyone except you, most of them feeling completely unremarkable in the moment they occur. The revolution is slow because identity is slow. What you're changing is not a habit. Habits can change quickly. What you're changing is a deeply internalized model of how you're supposed to move through the world. How much space you're entitled to. How much friction is permissible. How much of your own discomfort is acceptable to register out loud versus absorb silently. That model was built over decades. It doesn't update in an afternoon, but it does update. That's the part worth holding on to. Here's how the accumulation actually works. You hold a boundary in a low-stakes situation. Nothing dramatic. You just don't volunteer to absorb an inconvenience that isn't yours. Nobody notices. You notice. Your nervous system registers that the world did not end. That small registration is a data point. It doesn't feel like progress. It is progress. The next time, Slightly higher stakes. You finish a sentence you would previously have trailed off. You hold the eye contact 2 seconds longer than comfortable. You leave the silence after the firm statement instead of rushing to fill it. Again, nothing dramatic. Again, your nervous system registers the outcome, updates the prediction slightly. This is how the model changes, not through epiphanies, through accumulated evidence that contradicts the original assumptions. The original assumption was that asserting yourself creates damage to relationships, to your likability, to your safety and social environments. The accumulated evidence, built through repeated small experiments, is that it doesn't. That the damage was always a prediction, not an outcome. That the prediction was wrong. Every time you demonstrate that to your own nervous system, the threshold for the next assertion drops slightly. The voice steadies slightly. The pause after the boundary extends slightly. The apology that used to arrive automatically becomes slightly less automatic. It's gradual. It's not linear. There will be days where the old patterns resurface completely, where you absorb something you should have named, where you hear yourself over-explaining and can't seem to stop mid-sentence. Those days are not reversals. They're part of the process. The nervous system doesn't update in a straight line. It updates in the general direction of the evidence, with variance. Be patient with the variance. There's something else that happens during the slowest revolution that nobody prepares you for. The people around you notice before you do. Not always consciously, but the dynamic changes in ways they sense before they can articulate. They pause slightly longer before making certain requests. They frame things slightly differently. They stop assuming certain things about your availability that they previously assumed automatically. You might not see this as the progress it is. You might just notice that something feels different, slightly less frictionless, slightly less like you're moving through environments that have been optimized around your unlimited accommodation. That feeling is correct. The environment is recalibrating. Let it. I want to name something directly about this process that tends to get glossed over in favor of more inspiring language. Some relationships will not survive it. Not because you did something wrong, because the relationship was structurally dependent on your unlimited accommodation and cannot reorganize itself around a version of you that has limits. Those relationships ending is not failure. It is the system working correctly. The people who remain, who adjust, who meet the clearer version of you with respect rather than resentment, who find that they actually prefer knowing where your edges are. Those are the relationships that were real. The ones that end were transactions that had been calling themselves relationships. Letting them end gracefully is part of the revolution. Here's what accumulates on the other side of this process. Slowly, unremarkably, and then suddenly very noticeably. A reduction in the background noise of social anxiety. Fewer conversations replayed at 2 in the morning. Less second-guessing of things you said or didn't say. Fewer interactions that leave you depleted without obvious cause. A gradual increase in the sense that you are the same person in every room. Not performing different versions of yourself for different audiences. Not calibrating your personality to the social weather. Just present. Consistent. Legible. That consistency is the thing people eventually respond to as authority. Not the individual moments, the pattern across the moments. The reliable evidence that this person knows who they are and behaves accordingly, regardless of external pressure. That's what the slow accumulation builds. Not a reputation, a presence. And presence, unlike reputation, doesn't require maintenance. You don't have to manage it. You don't have to protect it or perform it or keep it updated. You just have to keep showing up as the same person. The same grounded, warm, clear, occasionally inconvenient, genuinely present person. That's the whole revolution. Stated plainly, it sounds almost too simple. Lived daily, across hundreds of small moments, it turns out to be the most demanding and most worthwhile project available to a human being. It starts with the next conversation. Not a dramatic one, just the next one. The next moment where the old pattern surfaces and you pause before complying with it. The next sentence you finish instead of trailing off. The next silence you hold instead of filling. Small, quiet, cumulative, the slowest revolution, and the most permanent one. Chapter 14. The Performance of Humility. False humility is just vanity wearing sensible shoes, and it is everywhere. In the person who prefaces every competent act with disclaimers about how they're probably wrong. In the person who deflects every compliment so aggressively, you begin to wonder if accepting one would physically injure them. In the person who consistently underrepresents their own capabilities, not because they genuinely doubt them, but because visible confidence feels socially dangerous, and self-deprecation feels like insurance against being perceived as arrogant. It is not humility. It is a preemptive strike against criticism, wearing humility's face. Real humility is accurate self-assessment. It knows what it's good at and says so without theater. It knows what it doesn't know and says that too, with equal plainness. It doesn't inflate and it doesn't deflate. It just measures correctly. And correct measurement, stated plainly, turns out to be one of the rarer and more commanding things a person can demonstrate. False humility, by contrast, is a social performance with a specific audience. The people who might otherwise find you threatening, presumptuous, or too much. You shrink yourself preemptively to manage their potential discomfort. You discount your own contributions before anyone else can. You introduce your ideas with qualifications that signal, I know this might not be worth your time, and I've already agreed with that possibility, so you don't need to say it. The performance is considerate in a way. It's also deeply dishonest. Here's what false humility actually communicates to people who are paying attention. And the ones worth impressing are always paying attention. It communicates that you don't trust your own assessment of your work, that your ideas require apologetic packaging to be presentable, that your presence at the table is slightly provisional, subject to review, contingent on others' continued tolerance, that underneath the disclaimers is a person who isn't entirely sure they're supposed to be here. People who are supposed to be somewhere don't announce their uncertainty about it before every contribution. I spent years in professional settings introducing my strongest ideas with some version of, I could be completely off base here, and believing I was being appropriately humble. I was not being appropriately humble. I was doing something much more self-serving than that. I was engineering a situation where I couldn't lose. If the idea landed well, I got credit. If it didn't, I'd already distanced myself from it. The disclaimer was not modesty, it was a hedge. I was protecting my ego under the cover of humility, which is vanity. Operational, functional, well-disguised vanity. The psychology underneath false humility is worth understanding clearly because it drives behavior in ways that are easy to misread as virtue. At its root is a specific fear, the fear of being seen as too much. Too confident, too direct, too certain, too present. This fear is not irrational. In certain social environments, particularly environments where women operate, or where cultural norms prize deference, visible confidence genuinely does attract negative social response. The self-deprecation developed as an accurate adaptation to a real environment, but it generalizes. It stops being a contextual tool and becomes a default setting. The person who learned to manage perceptions in one environment carries the behavior into every environment, including the ones where it costs them significantly, where their deliberate underrepresentation of their own capabilities results in being genuinely underestimated, where the disclaimers they intended as social lubricant get taken at face value, where they are treated as less capable than they are, because they have consistently and convincingly argued for that assessment. You taught people to underestimate you, with great skill and consistency, for years. Here's the distinction that matters practically. There is a version of acknowledging uncertainty that is honest and useful. When you genuinely don't know something, saying so directly, without theater, without excessive qualification, is accurate. That's real humility. Useful. Respected. The version that undermines you is the one that appears when you do know something, when you are capable, when your assessment is actually solid, and you wrap it in disclaimer anyway. Not because it's uncertain, because certainty feels unsafe to display. Certainty is not arrogance. Certainty is what happens when you've thought carefully about something and arrived somewhere. Displaying it is not a character flaw, it's communication. The recalibration required here is not the replacement of false humility with aggressive self-promotion. That overcorrection is its own problem, equally dishonest, significantly less charming. The recalibration is toward accuracy, stating what you know as what you know, stating what you don't know as what you don't know, presenting your work as your work, not as a tentative offering that might be worthless, subject to the group's generous evaluation. Practically, this means catching the disclaimer before it arrives. The sentence begins, "Here's a thought," and you feel the urge to add, "I'm probably wrong about this," or "this might be stupid." Stop before the addition. Let the sentence be what it is, a thought. Stated. Presented for consideration, not apologized for, not pre-discounted, not packaged in protective self-deprecation that signals your own doubt in it before anyone else has had the chance to form one. There is something that happens when you present your ideas without apologetic framing. People engage with the idea rather than with your uncertainty about it. They respond to the substance rather than to the social signal of someone who isn't sure they should be speaking. The conversation changes quality. Not because the idea changed, the idea was the same. Because you changed how you presented it. How you hold your own work determines, to a significant degree, how others hold it. Hold it accurately, not higher than it deserves. That's arrogance, and it's detectable and corrosive. Not lower than it deserves. That's false humility, and it's equally detectable and quietly self-destructive, exactly where it deserves, stated plainly, without theater in either direction. That accuracy, unglamorous, unheroic, quietly difficult to maintain, is what real humility looks like, and it turns out to be significantly more impressive than the performance. Chapter 15. The identity you keep outgrowing. The person you were when you learned these patterns is not the person reading this now. That sounds obvious. It isn't. Because the patterns didn't update when you did. They stayed exactly where they were formed, in older environments, with older stakes, under older conditions that no longer apply. And every day you run them, you are essentially taking instructions from a version of yourself that no longer exists. about a world that no longer surrounds you, to manage threats that are no longer present. This is the peculiar cruelty of deeply ingrained behavioral patterns. They were intelligent once. They solved a real problem in a real context with real consequences. The child who learned that staying small kept the peace in a volatile household made a genuinely smart adaptation. The adolescent who learned that self-deprecation deflected social targeting was reading the environment correctly. The young professional who learned that unlimited availability built early career capital wasn't wrong about the short-term math. The adaptation was correct. The problem is, it didn't come with an expiration date, so you carry it forward into environments where it doesn't fit, into relationships where it isn't necessary, into versions of your life that have structurally outgrown the strategy. But the strategy keeps running anyway, because strategies don't notice when the context changes. Only you can notice that. And noticing requires something most people find genuinely uncomfortable. It requires looking at your own behavior with enough honesty to ask, who taught me this? And do they still get to? Here's what that examination actually looks like in practice. You're in a meeting. A senior person says something incorrect, demonstrably, clearly incorrect, something you know well and they have wrong. You feel the knowledge in your chest, solid and certain, and then you feel the other thing. The familiar calculation, the assessment of risk, the ghost of every environment where correcting authority was dangerous. And you say nothing. Or you say something so softly qualified that it functions as nothing. Afterward, you think, why did I do that? The stakes were low. The relationship was fine. Nothing bad would have happened. Why did I defer when deferral was neither necessary nor useful? Because the pattern that ran in that moment was not calibrated to that moment. It was calibrated to a different moment, decades earlier, in a completely different environment with completely different consequences. The ghost of that environment showed up in the meeting room and made a decision on your behalf, and you let it. Because you didn't catch it in time. Because it moves faster than conscious awareness most of the time. I had a period in my early 30s where I became genuinely confused about my own preferences. Not dramatically, just a low-grade uncertainty about what I actually wanted versus what I'd trained myself to want in order to be acceptable to various environments. The preferences I'd suppressed for social reasons had been suppressed for so long, I'd stopped being able to locate them reliably. I'd optimized so thoroughly for external approval that the internal signal had gotten quiet. Getting it back required doing something that felt almost absurdly simple. Noticing, in small moments, what I actually thought before I edited it. Not acting on it necessarily, just noticing it. Building back the connection between the instinct and the awareness of the instinct. It took longer than it should have. The instinct was still there. It had just learned to be quiet. The identity you keep outgrowing is not something to be ashamed of. It was your best available response to conditions you didn't choose. But you are in different conditions now. And the most important update you can make is the one that recognizes this. Here's what makes this update genuinely difficult beyond the obvious. Identity, even an identity built on patterns that don't serve you, provides stability. You know who you are when you're the accommodating one, the dependable one, the one who doesn't make things difficult. That role is uncomfortable, but it's known. The alternative, a self that hasn't fully formed yet, that's in the process of updating, that doesn't quite know what it will do in situations where the old pattern would have kicked in automatically. That feels genuinely destabilizing. People choose known discomfort over unknown discomfort with remarkable consistency, even when the known discomfort is significant, even when they can see clearly that the unknown discomfort is probably temporary. The devil you know is an extraordinarily powerful force in human psychology. It keeps people in patterns they've explicitly identified as harmful because the patterns are at least familiar. Familiar is not the same as functional. This distinction is worth repeating until it stops needing to be. The update process is not the replacement of your old identity with a new one fully formed. It doesn't work that way. It's more like a renovation. The structure remains. The bones of who you are, the genuine warmth, the real care for others, the actual intelligence and capability, those stay. What gets renovated is the defensive architecture built around them, the walls that were constructed to manage threats that have since passed, the behaviors that protected you once and constrain you now. You're not becoming someone else. You're becoming more structurally honest about who you already are. Here's the practical work. When you catch an old pattern running, the reflexive yes, the unnecessary apology, the self-deprecating disclaimer, the preemptive shrink, pause before you complete it. Not to force a different behavior immediately, just to name it internally. That's the old pattern. That's the version of me that was responding to different conditions. That naming creates a gap, a small one. But in that gap is choice. And choice, repeated consistently, is how identity updates. Not dramatically. Not through declarations or reinventions or the motivated burst of change that arrives after a particularly resonant book and lasts approximately 11 days before the old patterns reassert themselves. Through the gap, through the pause, through the accumulated weight of small moments where you noticed the old instruction and decided quietly that you didn't have to follow it. The person you're becoming doesn't announce themselves in advance. They emerge through behavior, specifically through behavior that's slightly more honest than what the old pattern would have produced. Slightly more present, slightly more willing to take up the space they're actually entitled to. And one day, not dramatically, not with fanfare, you realize the gap has become the default, that the pause is no longer an interruption of the pattern. It is the pattern. That's when you know the identity has updated. Not when you decided to change, when the change became unremarkable, when standing where you are stopped feeling like an act of courage and started feeling like simply where you stand. Chapter 16. The person who doesn't need the last word. There is a specific kind of strength that looks, from the outside, almost exactly like weakness. It doesn't argue when it could win. It doesn't correct every error it notices. It doesn't pursue closure on every unresolved interaction. It lets some things sit unaddressed, not because it missed them, not because it lacks the capability to respond, but because it has made a deliberate assessment that the response isn't worth the cost. Most people can't do this. Not because they lack intelligence, because they haven't separated their self-worth from the outcome of individual interactions. When your identity is stable, you don't need every conversation to confirm it. When your sense of your own competence is internally grounded, you don't need to correct every misattribution out loud. When you know what you think, you don't need everyone in the room to know that you know. The last word becomes optional, not because you've surrendered, but because you've already arrived somewhere the argument was trying to take you. You're already there. The argument is no longer necessary transportation. The person who always needs the last word is not the most confident person in the room. They are the most anxious. Because the need to conclude, to correct, to ensure the record reflects their position accurately. That need comes from a place of genuine insecurity about whether their position will survive without active defense. They're not protecting a truth. They're protecting a self-image that doesn't feel secure enough to exist without continuous reinforcement, which means every conversation is also a referendum. And referendums are exhausting. Here's what it looks like when someone has genuinely moved past this. An accusation arrives, unfair, slightly distorted, the kind that in the past would have triggered an immediate detailed defense. They listen, they consider, they respond to whatever is actually worth responding to. And the rest, the distortion, the unfair framing, the implication they could easily counter, they let sit. Not because they missed it. They didn't. Not because they agreed with it. They didn't. Because they decided it didn't require their energy. That decision looks like passivity from the outside. It is the opposite of passivity. It is a deliberate allocation of a finite resource, attention, emotional energy, time, toward things that actually matter and away from things that merely sting. Most people have this exactly backwards. They spend enormous resources on things that merely sting and insufficient resources on things that actually matter. They'll spend 40 minutes mentally composing the perfect response to a dismissive comment and 40 seconds on a decision that significantly affects their actual life. The sting gets the attention. The importance gets the remainder. Letting go of the last word is a resource allocation problem. And solving it correctly requires a specific kind of self-trust. The trust that your position doesn't require constant defense to remain valid. That what you know remains true whether or not you've corrected the person who doubted it. That your competence exists independently of the last conversation's outcome. That trust is not given. It's built through the same slow accumulation described across these chapters. Through enough experience of standing in your own assessment and finding it reliable. Through enough evidence that you survived being misunderstood without being diminished by it. I let someone take credit for something I'd done once, in a professional context, in a room full of people who mattered. Not because I didn't notice, not because I was afraid to correct it. Because I looked at the situation and made a calculation. This person needs this more than I need the correction to happen publicly. The work will speak eventually. The record isn't lost. And this particular battle right now in this room will cost more than it returns. I said nothing. It sat uncomfortably for about a week. Then it stopped sitting uncomfortably. And the outcome, over the following months, was better than if I'd corrected it in the moment. Not because silence is always the right strategy, but because in that specific instance, it was. The ability to make that calculation, clearly, without resentment, without the martyrdom narrative of "look how generously I'm sacrificing," requires a self that isn't dependent on being seen correctly in every moment. That self is the goal. Not the one who always wins the argument. The one who has learned to distinguish between arguments worth winning and arguments that are just noise wearing the clothing of importance. Here's the uncomfortable truth about people who always need the last word. They are easy to manipulate. Extraordinarily easy. Because you know exactly which lever to pull. Just challenge something they've said, in any context, and they'll abandon whatever they were doing to mount a defense. They can be reliably redirected by anyone who understands the mechanism. The person who doesn't need to defend every position is significantly harder to move. You can challenge them. They'll consider it genuinely. If it warrants a response, they'll respond. If it doesn't, they won't. And the absence of response is not a concession. It's a classification. This didn't make the threshold. That classification, when it becomes visible as a pattern, communicates something powerful. That this person doesn't react to everything, which means when they do react, it means something. Their engagement becomes signal rather than noise. Their response to something carries weight precisely because their non-response to other things has demonstrated that they're selective. Selectivity in response is a form of authority that most people never develop, because developing it requires tolerating the discomfort of letting things go that the ego wants to address. The ego wants full credit, correctly attributed in real time, with witnesses. The self, the deeper, more stable version of you that exists underneath the ego's running commentary, doesn't need any of that. It knows what it did. It knows what it thinks. It knows where it stands. And it has discovered, through long practice, that knowing is enough. You don't need the room to confirm what you already know. You don't need the argument to conclude in your favor for your position to be valid. You don't need the last word to have said something true. The truest things, often, are the ones that didn't need defending. They just stood there, clear, unhurried, quietly unassailable, while the noise resolved itself around them. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength that doesn't need to announce itself, because it already knows it's there. The most radical thing you can do, it turns out, is stop moving out of the way. Not dramatically, not as a statement, just stop the automatic, reflexive, decades-long habit of adjusting your position before anyone has even asked you to. Stop preemptively shrinking. Stop volunteering your own limits as negotiating material. Stop treating your presence as something that requires ongoing justification to maintain. Just stop and stand where you are. That stillness, quiet, unhurried, completely undefended, turns out to be the most commanding thing a person can do in almost any social environment. Not because it's a technique, because it's true. Because it communicates without a single word that you have already decided where you stand, and you're not waiting to see if that's acceptable. You've spent a long time waiting to see if you're acceptable. You are. That question is closed. Here's what you actually learned across these chapters, stripped of all elaboration. You learned that kindness without structure is a vulnerability, not a virtue. That reliability without limits becomes infrastructure rather than relationship. That the apology reflex signals low status before you've said anything of substance. That explaining your no converts a boundary into a negotiating position. That boundaries set late carry 18 months of accumulated weight that early ones never would. That approval is a market with terrible exchange rates and a chronic tendency to crash. That your voice betrays the beliefs underneath your words. That standards, enforced quietly and consistently, do more work than declarations ever will. That shrinking is an adaptation, not a personality. That overgiving is a loop, not a virtue. That friction is information, not damage. That calm is the most structural form of authority available. That the revolution happens slowly, invisibly, one small, unremarkable moment at a time. All of it points to the same place. You don't need to become someone else. You need to stop performing as someone you're not. The performance has been exhausting. The version of you that says yes automatically, apologizes reflexively, explains unnecessarily, adjusts preemptively, shrinks habitually. That version requires constant effort to maintain. It's not the natural state. It's the managed state. The one built from decades of learning that smallness was safer than visibility. It was safer then. In the specific environments where you learned it, with the specific people who required it, it probably was the correct adaptation. You were right to make it. You adapted intelligently to the conditions you were in. The conditions changed. The adaptation didn't. That's the only problem. The version of you that exists on the other side of this process is not harder, not colder, not someone who has traded warmth for toughness and calls it growth. It's warmer, actually, because warmth that comes from genuine choice is qualitatively different from warmth that comes from the anxiety of being anything else. It's more generous, because generosity from abundance lands differently than generosity from depletion. It's more present, because you're no longer spending half your cognitive resources managing the performance. It's just cleaner, simpler, more honest, and more respected. Not because you demanded respect or declared it, or performed the behaviors associated with it. Because respect is what accumulates around people who know where they stand and stand there consistently. Around people whose yes means something specific because their no is real. Around people who are the same in every room, not performing, not adjusting, not running the continuous calculation of what this particular audience needs to see. Just present, just clear, just themselves. Here's the only instruction that matters going forward. In the next moment, not tomorrow, not when conditions are better, not when you've prepared more thoroughly. In the next moment where the old pattern surfaces, pause, 1 breath, 1 second of actual choice, and then do the slightly truer thing. Not the perfect thing, not the maximally assertive thing, not the thing that demonstrates you've absorbed everything in these chapters. Just the thing that's slightly more honest than what you would have done automatically. That's enough. That's the whole practice. One slightly truer thing, repeated across enough moments, becomes a different life. Not a louder life, not a harder life, a clearer one. And clear, it turns out, is what you were always capable of being. You just kept apologizing for it.